Well, every time that violence flares up in Israel and the Middle East, Jews who live outside Israel, in places like here in the United States and in Europe, where James is, find themselves in the spotlight. And it's not always a comfortable position to be in. There can be pressure to justify the actions of the Israeli state, or conversely, an expectation that you'll condemn them. Often the answer is, of course, a lot more complicated and nuanced than that.
Like any group, America's Jewish community holds a wide range of views on the state of Israel. But one thing that has become apparent is that those views are increasingly fragmented along generational lines. New research from the Pew Foundation finds that less than half of young American Jews feel attached to the state of Israel, compared to two-thirds of the older generation of Jewish Americans who feel a strong connection with Israel.
So let's talk about that with two Jewish Americans from both of those age groups who are members of the same family. Alyssa Rubin is age 26. She's in Colorado. And Jason Pearl, Alyssa's grandfather, is 89. He lives in Connecticut. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me. And Jason, if I may just start with you, I'm sure you have heard the news out of the Middle East that there is a ceasefire now. I just wanted to get, before we move on to our conversation, your reaction to that.
Well, note that it is a ceasefire. It is not an armistice. It is not the end of hostilities. This is a technical term. I was, in my younger days, a lawyer, and for some number of years, a judge advocate with the United States Army. So what we have here is a ceasefire. The armies, if you can call them that, because Hamas does not have what we consider a traditional army with uniforms and rank, insignia, and that sort of thing. But the armies remain in place, remain armed, simply do not shoot at each other.
And Alyssa, when you hear, I don't know if you were able to hear our correspondent there who's in Gaza, Rushdie Abu Alouf, describing the situation of Palestinians in Gaza. What does it make you feel after they've gone through those 11 days of bombardments?
Yeah, I mean, when I hear that, it really brings me back to 2014 and the last time there was this kind of escalation in Gaza, and just hearing the level of trauma that people are going through, and knowing, I think this was also stated by the correspondent, that, you know, this isn't going to, a ceasefire is not an end, and that the conditions that have led to this moment are still in place and have been for many, many decades, and are just becoming more and more exacerbated.
Alyssa, do you discuss views on Israel with your grandfather who's with us now, and do you ever get him to see things your way?
We do talk about it quite a bit over the last many, many years, and I think he can probably answer for me about whether I've been able to convince him of anything.
Well, let's ask Jason. I don't know if you heard that from your granddaughter. Does she ever convince you to see things her way?
Well, I hearken back to, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings come words of wisdom.
Alyssa?
Yes.
So
he's right sometimes.
So, Jason, how would you characterize the difference in opinion that you and Alyssa have when it comes to the state of Israel?
I lived through the birth of Israel. I know what it is for the Jewish people not to have a homeland. I know what it is for Jews around the world to carry passports of different countries, whether it be the United States or Ireland or the universe of the South America, those countries, and to have on their passports stamped a black letter J for Jew or Yud or Yiddish, to be someone in a country but outside the country. Now we all have Israel to look to as a homeland for the Jewish people.
Is it possible, Jason, to support Israel and to support the Palestinian cause?
Well, I think my granddaughter has found the key, and I'm going to shoot that question over to her, because she seems to have found a way to be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in an intellectual way, in an intellectual way, and yet be very proud of her Yiddishkeit, of her Jewishness, and firm in her standing in the Jewish community. So I think you ought to direct that question to her.
And I will do in a second. I was just wondering if it was something that you were able to do.
No. That's as brief
Alyssa?
an answer as I can give you.
Alyssa?
Yeah, I mean,
Alyssa,
I think what my grandpa said is, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that what my grandpa said is really spot on, in that my support for Palestinian liberation and my love for the Jewish community and being Jewish and wanting Jews to be safe in the world are not incompatible at all, and are actually extremely, extremely intertwined. And I think that is that's a distinction, and that's a false choice that many of us have been given, that to be Jewish is to support this modern state of Israel unequivocally, and that to care about Jews requires the oppression of Palestinians. And I think that my generation is really seeing the ways in which Israel has not been able to keep Jews safe, especially I think for American Jews, young American Jews, that in the years after 2016, after Trump's election, we saw anti-Semitic violence in this country unlike anything that we had seen before. And we're also seeing the ways in which the current conditions are not keeping Israelis safe. And, their Israeli children are being sent into war, not to mention that it's not keeping Palestinians safe. And so I think our generation is just having this reckoning of what does it actually mean to have Jewish safety, because we're not seeing it
Alyssa,
in the current setup.
I'm so sorry, Alyssa, you're having this very measured conversation with your grandfather. You've grown up with different perspectives. Do you think you'll be having those kind of conversations with your own grandchildren in several decades' time about Israel and being Jewish and being safe?
I hope that these are not the conversations that we're having, because it's been over 70 years of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if this is the paradigm that we're still having the conversation in 40, 50 years, I think that it is going to mean that there's been a lot more harm that's happened, and that we are not going to be any closer to.
Jason, you are 89. You're not as young as you were. Are you worried what happens when your generation is no longer with us to the memories of the younger generation? Do you feel that your generation, in a way, is the last connection to what happened in the Second World War and to the reason there is a need for an Israeli Jewish state?
If not the last, certainly the next to the last. The children of the Holocaust will come after us, but after that, I doubt that there will be much of a emotional tie to Israel. It will be more of a diplomatic and political matter, and not an emotion. In other words, I hearken back to the night of the proclamation of the State of Israel. I was just a teenager, but I remember that night as vividly as if it were yesterday. And it was a great night in my life because it meant that we now had our homeland. It's a place that we prayed about every day in our prayers, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. It meant a great deal to us as we were growing up as Jewish American kids. And now it had come to fruition. But of course, with episodes such as we've just lived through, there is a great danger. I sometimes worry that the beautiful cities of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and that they will suddenly fall prey to indiscriminate rockets. Remember, the rockets that are sent out from Hamas are indiscriminate in their targetry. They simply go out and they're headed for Jewish areas. And unlike the Israeli ordinance, which can uh, zero in on a particular building, on a particular street, in a particular city, these are very indiscriminate rockets, and they go toward the Jewish population, and they land where they land. And there's a big difference. I mean, where in history do you find a situation such as we saw with the bombing of the Associated Press building, where you send in an hour ahead of time paper messages
Right.
saying, "Get out of the building. We're going to bomb it, and if you stay in it, you're going to get killed." I mean, you can't ask for a more moral approach to the dastardly business called war.
Jason Pearl and Alyssa Rubin, grandfather and granddaughter, I have a feeling this is a conversation that you two will need to continue, and hopefully you can continue offline. We have to wrap up this interview there, but it was a pleasure speaking to both of you, and thank you for your humanity towards each other and your generous compassion towards each other in what is a very difficult conversation.
Let me say that the most important thing is we respect each other's differing opinions.
And it shows. Thank you. Jason and Alyssa, thank you very much for joining the conversation. Let's quickly